My name is Augusto Lopez-Claros. I'm the director of the Global Indicators Group at the World Bank. This is the unit that manages the Doing Business report, as well as a few other projects like enterprise surveys. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. Thank you very much for coming. I apologize for the slight delay, but we had some technical difficulties here with Hernando's presentation. I will not review for you Hernando's very substantial biography. You have in your materials his, the basics of his very distinguished career. In thinking about economic development, it seems to me that our understanding of what matters for growth and development has shifted over the years. I think that Hernando will agree with me that in the 1980s and the early 1990s, macroeconomic stability seemed to be a very, very important concern among policymakers and the academic community. We understood that it would be very difficult to have sustainable economic growth in the context of very high and unstable inflation, very unstable exchange rates, and so on. Hernando and I both come from Latin America, and in the 1980s, we had a number of countries that had very, very volatile, very high inflation rates. Now, as central banks met with increasing success in dealing with the issue of inflation, the focus shifted to other areas, to institutions, to education, to innovation. And this shift in focus was, to a great extent, certainly in Latin America, but later on elsewhere in the world, due to the work of thinkers like Hernando, who showed just how tremendously important is the set of rules that underpin the activities of the private sector. Because the private sector ultimately is the area of the economy where we create jobs, where we create economic growth. Hernando's work in the 1980s showed that where rules don't make sense, you're going to have higher levels of corruption, you're going to have higher levels of informality, you're going to have a narrower tax base, you're going to undermine the capacity of the state to deal with critical, important development issues that are going to contribute to improve competitiveness, to establish a foundation for solid economic growth. I remember when in 1987, Hernando's The Other Path book came out. For me, it was like a breath of fresh air. Especially coming from a region where a lot of the policy debates in the 1960s and the 1970s had been tinged, with sort of a heavy ideological undertone. And Hernando here in 1987 came out with this book where actually he said, hey, the data matters. Maybe we need to have a very solid foundation a more solid foundation of data in order for us to have more enlightened policy debates. In any case, Hernando has been for the last 25 years part of those debates, initially in Latin America, subsequently elsewhere in the world. He's going to share with us some thoughts today as to why doing business actually has a much bigger constituency than that we normally think about. Hernando.
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, the technology isn't working because I had a really good picture show for you. So we'll start from what we've got. That was I was going to be able to increase it, and so you'd see what's going on. So first thing I'm going to do regarding myself and my team, I will not go back to 87, because then I'll sound to you like an old timer who's got all these good old stories to tell. But I'll tell you that we're very active. We're now active in the Middle East. We're working in 6 countries. We've been called by the heads of state of 6 countries because we feel that a lot of what we did back in the 80s, at least in Peru, was the Latin American Spring. And what they've got now is the Arab Spring. The interesting about a spring, of course, is that from when everything looks like it's going really bad, it's actually the best moment to change. Because the biggest enemy of change is the status quo. And one thing about crisis is that the status quo gets really, really weak. So I'm going to tell you basically 2 stories. I'm going to tell you a story about the Middle East. And once that's finished, I'm going to tell you a story about Peru, my home country. So starting with the Middle East, you'll see here, at the beginning, the cart of a fruit street vendor. You may remember that the Arab Spring began on the 17th of December of 2010, when a street vendor called Mohamed Tariq Bouazizi in the fair city of Sidi Bouzid set himself on fire. You may remember that. And that all of a sudden got people marching on the streets, and everybody going, seems to go in the same direction. Well, to us, this sounded very familiar because we were all about the informal economy in Peru. That's what we looked at. So we've put a team in there with USAID money, and we spent 2 years. We've now got about, I think, a little bit over 300 headlines in the Middle East and a bestseller on why this all started. When we went there, we went to visit the family of Bouazizi. That is now in a book that's come out in French. It's going to come out in English. And it tells the story of what happened to him and why he lit himself on fire. I mean, committing suicide, and in a painful way, is very significant. But in the process, as we started looking at the different newspaper items, we started seeing that he didn't light himself on fire alone. In the same 2 months, 63 other people lit themselves on fire, and they were all entrepreneurs. And since every time you're going to light yourself on fire, I mean, if you decide that that's the way you're going to take yourself out, that means you have a statement to make. And so at that time, everybody's now got a cell phone, a camera. So we've got it all recorded. What everybody said the moment they lit themselves up. But more than that, of the 64 that lit up, all the way from Tunisia down to the Yemen, up to Syria, they all, 37 survived. They were extinguished. So we've interviewed them. And so if you are looking at PBS this month, it's called Unlikely Heroes, and it's 1 year of filming done by PBS about what we've discovered, and hopefully that will get into the mainstream. And you'll see that it's really about doing business, because these guys committed suicide because they couldn't do business. Bouazizi, before he dies, says the reason he's dying, and he says, the poor also have the right to buy and sell. No religious statement, no political statement. None of them had a religious statement. None of them had a political statement. It was all about basically business. Now, we've been working for some time in the Middle East, and one of the reasons we get around, among other things, is because some of us Latin Americans just look like Arabs, so we get around really easy. Nobody gets arrested us. We can't put a destroyer in front of a port, so we get through really easy with USAID money. And when we're there, we start saying, well, start talking to us about your life, because we have spent 3 months trying to find out why Mohammed would actually commit suicide, because we've gone pineapple by pineapple, fruit by fruit, artichoke by artichoke, the scale. You know, it's $225. Now, he's poor. He makes about $600 a month. But $225 to commit suicide, it can't have just been that. Oh, yes. The word is they took away his, they expropriated him. Il n'y a rien de pire que l'expropriation. Expropriation. He never used the word property right. He used the word expropriation. And we said, but what happened? And it took us time to find out what had actually happened. But the way it works is this. If you go into Sidi Bouzid, which is this, 38,000 inhabitants, there isn't one set of laws for the whole city. There isn't even one set of laws for all of Tunisia. There's not one set of laws for the whole city. There's 9. There's 9 different ones. And they're all what we call informal, extra-legal. They're local adaptations. And each one of them has got a boss. And we don't have really, in none of the developing countries where the poor are, what you call the rule of law. The rule of law for us is standard law. That's what it took you Brits time to make, over time, with judges. And that's why you say change is slow. But once you did the Industrial Revolution, and the Germans were looking at you, And the French were looking at you. They knew you were on the right track. But they didn't change the Roman law system. They simply adapted it to your invention. And when you adapt, you can do it over a year. You don't have to wait if you're convinced, because we've got Napoleonic codes. So the way the world is structured is that you, as de Gaulle would have said, les Anglo-Saxons, go up and break the waves, and we can follow right behind you. So here you've got 9 systems. And when he was expropriated, it's the same story with the 63 other guys. When the man comes in and he says, I'm taking away your cart from you, he hasn't taken away only your cart. He also took what he was saving for. He wanted to make ras el mel, which is the word in Arabic for capital. And he was going to do it on the basis of a mortgage of his home, but he only had a certificate. He was going to get his property title afterwards. And the moment the woman said, I'm taking away all your fruit, he knew that his property title was out. He knew that the possibility of getting that truck so that he could get closer to the fruit market was out as well. He knew that his possibility of forming a company where he gets limited liability was finished. Now, probably you, les Anglo-Saxons, when you talk about property rights, you don't think of limited liability. But limited liability goes a long way to protecting your property. Because limited liability means that if my limited liability is $5,000, you can't go past that. So the Desoto Effect goes beyond real estate. You have to read 3 centuries of British history to get where I am today, because that's where I feel we developing countries are, somewhere around the 18th century in terms of law. And when you look at those authors who inspire us, the Scots and others, that's what we're talking about. Property law really means, for us, not real estate. For us, it's the ability to own. How much stuff has the king left for you to decide upon? And once you look at it that way, I was in 10 Downing Street 2 mornings last year. It's because Cameron is getting the Millennium Development, he's a co-chair, the Millennium Development Goals. And he's all for property rights. And so he said, Hernando, property rights, very important. Mortgages and all of that. I said, yeah, but that's not the way to look at it, Prime Minister. The way to look at it is, think of since the Second World War, how many wars have you Brits gotten into with the Americans that have been really about sovereignty, and how many have been about property? I said, well, I don't know. Well, Libya, who owns the oil? You've been protesting against Bibi Netanyahu's policies in Israel regarding settlements. What's that? Sovereignty or property? I don't know. All these guys that are fighting next to the Taliban, what does the Taliban promise them? Property. That's what it's doing. So it goes much further. So next time the International Labor Organization comes and bothers you, you have to tell them that the majority of people that they think are in actually labor are in business. They do a little bit of labor, but they're in business. They were like you were when you started your Industrial Revolution. Remember the putting out system, the cottage industries? At that time, what the unions did, they defended labor and small industry. If they adapted to that, which they did at a conference in the ILO, they should have nothing against doing business, provided it gets to all the little guys as well. So, having gotten carried away by that, what does that mean? If you actually went in there and said, all right, now what gets 315 million Arabs, 60 to 70% of them outside the legal system, why don't they come in? Well, there's a lot of good reasons. First of all, if you want to get a piece of property sandy around Cairo, 10 years. You will spend 3 years of your life as an Egyptian trying to defend your property. You want to open a pharmacy, 60, it makes about 1,000 days. You want to open a bakery, it takes 550 days. You get into debt, chances you end up in jail 2 years are pretty good in Egypt. 90% of the jails are filled with people who can't pay their debts. You keep on going on, and you keep going on, and you can understand why everybody gets really angry. I mean, I talk to my Arab friends. They really have even more problems than we Latin Americans do trying to get our act together. We don't do it badly. But compared to Arabs, I mean, we're fantastic. We need to look like Europeans. We need to look like Americans. They can't get themselves even organized around Israel. They can't get a common agenda. But when one guy got expropriated, 63 more did, all throughout the Middle East, they rose up. And everybody says, it's dignity. Sure, we all got dignity. It's religion. That's not what they said. It is that you won the battle. The West won the battle about what's the best way of organizing over 40, 50 years ago. You just did. And everybody wants to go in that direction. Now, they're not looking at your policies. Now, let me see. What does Senator McCain say? What does Romney say? Is Barack Obama a little bit to the left or right? They don't know about that. They just know that you're very successful. And every time we filmed them burning, guess what they were wearing? Sneakers. That's not very Arab. White socks. Yick. Blue jeans. Basketball. I mean, look at them. White t-shirts. They were going west. But if they're going to keep on going west, you got to recognize that they're going west. You can't say ragheads. You can't say Islamists. You got to talk to them in their own language. You got to remember that Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone wore dead animals on their heads. They didn't look like the Wall Street guys of today. So the guys doing business don't necessarily wear neckties and coats. They look like the Arab Spring. And the sooner that comes across, the more peaceful it's going to be. So one of the most interesting things about the Arab Spring is that it isn't that it comes from, I've got a brother who's involved in Middle Eastern affairs. He teaches about that. This is his thing. He was being a mediator between Israel and all that. And so he's loaded down with Arab history. I mean, he knows the whole thing. He's so confused. To me, it's very simple. It's the Industrial Revolution. We saw it coming in Latin America. We saw it coming 50 years ago. There was Castro, and there was the other guy. There was no doubt who was successful. That's it. And we've proved it by migrating in the droves to the United States. All us Mexicans, all us Peruvians, all of us Salvadors, Jennifer Lopez, we're here. Now, how do you get the indicators? There are indicators. There isn't one place that we've been to the Middle East that doesn't have a document. Now, in Egypt, was it signed by Mubarak? No, it was signed by the Muslim Brotherhood. In Tunisia, it's signed by one of these guys. It's all documented. All people over the world have got a piece of paper. What they don't have is rule of law piece of paper, which is one standard one, right? I come in here and I take out my credit card. It's Visa. I can go anywhere in the United States. I can go anywhere in the world. That's what they don't have, standard. But that they've got the sources from which you built your national realities and your international reality, they have that. And that's what we do in our own small scale, financed by you. And when our project gets big enough, in comes the World Bank and takes it over. That's more or less the history. And everybody forgets what happens before, which is that essentially there is a world revolution taking place. And it's a world revolution in your direction, but that can easily be kidnapped. It can easily be hijacked because it's not ideologically inclined. It just means following whatever is successful. And that means that your projects have got to be targeted. So for example, one of the things that's very typical, my part of the world is to say, you need better laws. You bet you do. Of course we need better laws. That's what we were talking about, Augusto, bad laws in Latin America. But then who makes our laws? Well, I'll tell you the Peruvian story. It's a policy of mine. I've got so many enemies, I like to concentrate them in one place as much as possible, and that's Peru. Okay, the Congress makes 350 laws a year. 350. The judiciary makes none. So in come all these missions to improve our judges, thanks, but they don't make laws. And the executive branch makes 28,000 a year. That's where you have to focus. That's what's got to be done. Because once they're convinced, then things will begin to change. So the whole thing is about nuts and bolts, the way you said it, Tim. But you know, it's very funny because we use in my institute, we call it nails and screws. And you know, the reason we studied nails and screws is because we think that the most useful thing, as de Gaulle would say, that you les Anglo-Saxons saw, was that what made capitalism interesting was it wasn't the substance, the wood, the stone, but it's those things that make things come together, like nuts and bolts, like nails. Jefferson, former president of the United States, used to say, you know, in my family, my distinguished position is I am the nail maker. He made the nails in the Jefferson family, because in those days, it wasn't just wire that you could cut. You actually had to make the nail. And so as you moved in manifest destiny westward towards California, and you built log cabins on the way, once you settled a place, got some property, stayed there 4 or 5 years, Clint Eastwood and Fannie Mae get together and move further towards Mexican territory, used to be ours. You keep on moving, okay, in that direction. What do? They burnt down the log cabin to pick up the nails and keep on going, nuts and bolts. Because everything that is around us, everything that we have around us is the result of a combination. It's putting things together. God gave us everything we have. But like the Easter Bunny, he hid them all in the wrong places. And what business is about is entrepreneurship. It's about bringing it together and raising the capitals to bring it together. And so when you say law is what's missing, is that law is the nails and screws. It's the mortar of the business. It brings things together, which is why these darn Swiss, who use our cocoa, our sugar, produce a lot better chocolate than we do. It's our stuff, but they got the combo. It's the mélange. It's how you bring it all together. So doing business is the most important thing that actually concerns the third world. But what you've got to do is put it in the agenda. And to put it in the agenda, you need to know what governments who have the monopoly over law think about it. So I go to my second story. Now, this is supposed to work. Where are my colleagues? Is this it? Can I have one of my colleagues come up? Beautiful Peruvian lawyer, about to, yeah, no, we'll put the video at the, we can't do the video, all right. So I just want to get to the first thing. Let me tell you, here we go. Actually, what we had is a short little video where I joined President Clinton about 5 weeks ago in Rio. And he was saying, he's installing the Clinton Global Initiatives for Latin America. And he asked me to present it with him. And I'm an FOB, which means a friend of Bill's. And what happened is there, he said, you know, we've done lots of good things in Latin America. I'm the president that he's been most around, more than any other president. Plan Colombia, and that. And what I wanted you to hear was when I told him, your biggest success in terms of U.S. foreign policy was Peru. And it was all USAID financed. And nobody's noticed it. So we're going to try and make you notice it. This is Peru. This is 1896, all the way up till 2012. At that dot, where you see where we declined from blue to red, Peru had 7,600% inflation. Our GDP had just dropped 13.4. 60% of Peru was under emergency rule because we had a terrible terrorist movement called the Shining Path that had taken over 60% of territory. Today, our GDP per capita growth rate has doubled that of the rest of Latin America. That doesn't mean we're richer. It means we're growing twice as fast. Now, of course, you could say they're also poorer. Sure, but that's statistics. The next thing is our middle class, 4 times, growing 4 times more, and it's all USAID. We did it with USAID. You got a memory problem there somewhere. But what did we do? Well, what we did was part luck, part not luck. Do I put the arrow going up or going down? We've just retraced because some of the Shining Path are back, and because all of a sudden an economic historian came to see us and said, you know, with you Peruvians, it's the first, since the post-communist world, it's the first anti-terrorist war that we've won. We're stuck in Afghanistan, we're stuck in Iraq, but in Peru, we won the war in 12. The Colombians, our friends, who do a great job, are still negotiating with them. They're negotiating with them in Havana, of all places. We didn't. Here's the story. The story is that more or less 1980s, when I came back to Peru, 7 years before the other path, this movement comes out of nowhere called the Shining Path, very well organized. These are Maoists. And they go to the countryside and they say, justice, fairness. And the countryside succumbs. That's 1980. And then they say something they shouldn't have said if they had talked to us, you or us, which is they said, we're going to have communal property, no currency, bad habit, and we're not going to have markets, central board, Kantorovich, you name it. And they hadn't realized that all the farmers of Peru have already privatized their land on their own, albeit illegally. So they didn't like it at all. And they said, that's not going to happen. And so the Shining Path said, well, it is going to happen because this country is going to have discipline, and these are the amount of deaths, and boom, they go in and kill something like 35,000 farmers in 3 years. The farmers are basically illegal. So they've got no way of defending themselves. The Peruvian troops come in, and it's Vietnam. How do you tell the enemy from a friend? The more they came in, the more enemies we had. So they start forming a 20,000-man army to defend private property and business, small business, no limited liability, no credit, none of the good things. And they start driving them back. This, by the way, is unpublished. We hope it'll be out in about 2 weeks. It's unpublished. This has only been brought together. The Bush papers, President Bush, Daddy was in power there, have just gotten declassified. So, bang, we come down here. Shining Path gets organized again and then drives them back, and deaths go up. Then, at that time here, Rand in Washington reports to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Peru is on the brink of internal collapse. Sendero could win. They're firmly entrenched in the highlands. Bernie Aronson, Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs, Inter-American Affairs, goes to Congress and says, it's about a year. We should prepare some kind of a U.S. intervention. Never been U.S. troops south of Puerto Cabello, but that's the way it was. But at that time, with USAID money, we had already begun preparing ourselves. And we said it's very simple. What's happening is that the farmers are fighting with no property. They're fighting their terrain, but they've got problems. You've got to have some kind of order in the place. And some of them occasionally grow coca here and there, the coca leaf. Now, we don't do the coca. I mean, the entrepreneurs were the Colombians. Now it's the Mexicans. We have the proletariat of the business. And we said, if the United States doesn't give us the okay, we can't fight because they're the only ones who know who they are. They're the only ones that can go out and do a humanistic war if you want to. And you've got to be able to locate them. So we had a plan going on with USAID. And the plan consisted of the following thing. It consisted of getting the United States to say they are in business, they're entrepreneurs, they're nice guys, and they're not the Colombians, and they're not the paramilitary. So we actually we had to take it from here to there, to the Department of Defense, and then move it upwards as high as we could. Sorry. And we got to the White House. because that's where you got to get if you want to change things. So there's Ben Scowcroft, there's President Bush, there's President Fujimori, who since then has had another fortune, all sorts of misfortunes, but he was there. That's myself, and it's the finishing touch. And all it requires is the United States to say, these are small entrepreneurs. They're not like the other guys. We should really try and get ourselves together. The way Bush announced it at that time is, I didn't realize it, but these little guys are on our side. That's all it took. And then, as soon as that happened, and we started then awarding them property rights, and the rights to do business, and get their markets back, and use currency. In other words, doing business in a very, very small scale, this starts happening. We start winning the war, because they fought with spears. Now they were allowed pellet guns, one pellet at a time. But with one pellet at a time, they started driving the shining path. I don't know if any of you are aware of that film, remember, Augusto, The Dancer Upstairs, about the capture of Abimael Guzman, the head of the Shining Path. Well, he gets captured here. We start winning the war here. And so the film I was going to show you now was 5 weeks ago with President Clinton. He said, we got Plan Colombia going. I said, Plan Colombia, Plan Schlumumbia. We did it without $7 billion and with USAID, and I say it in public. Because you see, it all comes together. It is about the rule of law. It all comes together. And what was interesting is that that army was a pro-doing business army. That's what they said. That's the way they termed themselves. Since we don't have much time, I can't show you really the rest of the stuff. The only thing is we did bring the United Nations in. Doing business wasn't around then. We would have called you in. Sorry, here we go. So we got the United Nations, and we said, this is the last proof we need to give the United States. We've got criminals out there, we've got drug traffickers out there, we've got shining path Maoists out there, and we got these farmers. Now ask a criminal, a shining path guy, ask a drug trafficker, can I have your address, please? And full information. Your wife, I want to know who your kids are, where they go. That's the last thing they'll do. The first thing that is characteristic of an outlaw is he isn't in business. They don't want anything on records. How does an outlaw pay you? With a suitcase full of bills. How does somebody who's decent to pay you? They sign something. So we said all of those who want private property have got to be identified. All of those who want to have the right to bear arms have got to be identified with the United Nations. Now, we had, of course, something going for us, which is the Secretary General of the United Nations was Peruvian. And Peruvians do things family-wide. So we put all of that in, and they all signed up. So after a while, we knew who were the good guys against who were the bad guys. We brought them under the rule of law, and we won the war. And President Clinton, my friend, wins the election. And then all of a sudden, there's nobody to tell the story. Fujimori decides to do a coup d'etat. He goes off that way. Eastern Europe and Central Europe become hot. Every USAID guy that I know intimately is off to Prague. They're off to Moscow, and nobody writes a story. But this is a doing business story. What it tells you are the following things. I think, as conclusions, I took notes. My problem is always being able to read my own writing, so here it goes. The first thing that you said, Tim, was academia, policy advice, policy making. We economists tend to tell, at least we Latin American economists tend to say, if only the president understood economics. He doesn't. The president does. What a president wants is a constituency. So if you tell him, I'm going to help business, and it's 5% of the population, he doesn't have a constituency, he knows it. But if you tell him you've got 80% of the country, you got all the laws you want on your side. But you've got to identify with all of those. And you got to show that they're not labor alone, but they're doing business. There's the souks, there's the bazaars. We on our side, the third world guys that are westernized. You know, the 80% of us Peruvian elites that can understand a Benny Hill joke or Seinfeld. Okay, we're 5% if we're lucky. But to get to those guys, you got everybody on your side. And they're in business. That means that the Arabs have got to stop saying, look at the souks, look at the bazaar. They've got to consider that they're one of their own. It's a class thing. It's a politics thing. You can't get away from the politics. Before markets work, there's always a political victory because you have to win against the status quo. There are enemies, and what you just faced over the last year, comes in your celebration, was a first attack of the status quo. A status quo that pretends that the West is like the South. 4% of Peruvians are unionized. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It means that the unions have got to go out and defend the little people as well. The log cabin industries, that's where we are. The next thing that you need is to understand that it's not just about business. It's about security. It's about life in general. That's what the Industrial Revolution meant. You Brits are very proud of it. You went from being a mass of guys to being individuals. It's a big change. So it isn't just about doing business. It's about much more. Business also sounds funny. About all these scandals after derivatives, nasty word. So don't go out fighting for words. Find a subdivision. Call it something else. But do politics, because it's politics that's going to attack you. Next thing you got to know is Roman law. Sorry, we don't have judge-made law, Roman law. We got to get to the executive branch. The next thing is, remember, everything that you see that doesn't work in the third world. Who does the Suez Canal belong to? Remember, there was a war about it, property. That wasn't about sovereignty. You weren't about to take over Egypt. What's the oil about? It's all about a property issue. It's much bigger than real estate. It's much bigger than title insurance. It's much bigger than Her Majesty's Land Registry, with all due respect. Next thing you've got to see is the following thing, that what you talked about improving the business environment, sir. That's a business environment. It's right down your alley. It is the business environment. And probably the hardest argument, the toughest one for any, I would say, North American. I mean, listen to my accent. I mean, I've got a second nation, it's the United States. I'm a John Travolta fan. I tend to go for the Latin side. I tend to go to the Paul Anka sort of stuff. But there is an American side of me. And the idea there is the following one. You won the war. Ideologically, you won the war. They don't look like you. They don't act like you. They have a different religion. But you've won that war. It's there on the side. But you've got to be able to, essentially, you've got to be able to do something, I think two things that are very hard to understand. Being humble, as you Americans are, is the following. I'm not saying that as a joke. You won the war. You really did. There's other cultures, but you won. There is no other system. There is no other system. And the second thing that you've got to do, I think, is dissociate your 18th and 19th century from our 21st century. When you approach Latin America, there's something of Wounded Knee and General Armstrong Custer in you. We did these people wrong. And yes, you probably did it so bad, like we also did it so bad, that we couldn't even celebrate 500 years of Columbus discovering America. We did it so bad. But they're about, what, 1% of your population? 2% of your population, the indigenous people? Canada, it's 3%. Us, it's 80%. And they're fighting for private property, and they want to do business. Big jump. All right, I think I finished. Thank you.
I'm looking at my watch, and I think what I will do is I will allow for 2 questions, brief ones, and then we'll go to the next 3 sessions. You have your schedule in front of you. They are, I think, all on this level. FDI and trade on room 450, entry regulations on 415, and reforms, development outcomes, and political economy, I think, stays here. Yes, please.
I don't have a microphone, but I do have a radio voice. I'm John Sullivan from the Center for International Private Enterprise, and I have to ask you, Hernando, how do you mobilize that 80%? How do you get them to come out and demand change?
Well, they don't have ideology. So the reason the Shining Path was a danger was because it can be hijacked, just like the Arab Spring can be hijacked. They're angry. Just like the Russian Revolution got hijacked. They're against the status quo. They do the only thing that's at their reach, which is business. You can get organized by families. You start moving that way. And if they feel alienated, Marx had a point here and there. Alienated means they don't feel part of it. They will go the other way. But their first instinct is to go the business way. So I think that they're also going to do it with their own words. They don't necessarily have the word property, for example. They don't necessarily have it. Interestingly enough, the Arabs do have the word capital, but they don't have the word property. So they'll come out with their own sort of stuff. And the other thing that you've got to, I think it's important to understand, is that it's going to work itself out. We don't know how it's going to work itself out. There is no set route. I mean, if you take what the Swiss do, and you say it's the outcome of being an individual, et cetera, well, they've got a country with 7 presidents. And those 7 presidents are not at all anything like a British prime minister. And a British prime minister isn't at all elected like a Norwegian prime minister. And the Japanese have got a diet and they function another way. So we don't know how it's going to come out. They'll find their culture, they'll find their own way. I think what the West can do that's very important are things like doing business. I really think there's an enormous area for doing business, but it's going to require leadership. Leadership of sorts, or branching out in one direction. But I think the important thing to understand is this, is that what you've done is something Immanuel Kant would have called categorization, the categories that you have in it. What you've got for the moment, I think, in all the goodwill of the West, you've decided these are street vendors, these are micro-entrepreneurs, this is microcredit, there's people that need this, and you've broken up into little sort of like drops of water. And the interesting thing about that is not the drops of water, but that all these drops of water are coming into like a wave. And when they come in like a wave, there's a collective identity. And that's what's got to be addressed. And what's got to be addressed is this. I mean, when you Westerners want us guys from the third world to go a certain direction, I mean, you push. That's the direction you have to push. So I don't think you can expect any of these little guys. Oh, there's another problem, of course, which is the following one, is because they don't have institutions. It's very difficult that among themselves they establish a sort of a common movement. The way I think, John, to look at this, I've said it before, and I remember saying in front of you, and you didn't like it all the way. I said the best way an American can understand what's going on there is the Wild West, right? Manifest Destiny. 35 million Europeans imported. Oof. You move across Latin territory. And Billy the Kid, and everybody gets shot. How do you put law and order? Son, I like the way you shoot. Here's a Marshall badge. And you keep on moving, and you start putting law and order gradually. 32 times in your history in the 19th century, 32 times you beat down your Supreme Court. Because your Supreme Court says this is not the way to award business rights. This is not the way to do land grants. It's not British history. But the guys locally say, sorry, from Little Miami River to California, we're going to base ourselves on land improvements. How many logs you cut down? How much corn you planted? This is the American way, the ingenuity of the American way. And that's the way you did it, all the way to California, 1896. Then you started getting your act together. Before that, it was a pretty, I mean, the Wild West was a pretty wild place. So it's I have a feeling it's going to go somewhere like that, and you got to play it case by case. But the important thing to remember is that they are doing business. That's where they get their money from, and that's easy to establish. And the reforms you have to make is stop thinking so much 21st century. That's us, the guys who can laugh at Seinfeld. It's the other guys who can't laugh at Seinfeld. They're not going to be recognizable. But believe you, they've got no other solution. The reason they don't have any other solution, let me see if I've got it here. Oops, let's see if we've got it. Yeah, my colleague, Manuel Mayorga, asked me to. She said that this would be very helpful. This is ILD sociology. 1 billion people of the world are trapped in traditional economies. That's the kind of thing the History Channel wants. Don't touch them. They love it the way they are. You don't touch them. 4 billion have started moving westward. They're moving westward. They're dressing like us. I mean, see a manifestation today in pick up Caracas, right? Blue jeans. They're all moving around. They look like Puerto Ricans. Palestine, they all look like Puerto Ricans too. That's the 4 billion. But when they get to that wall, that's the anti-doing business wall. That's what you got to go. Now, it's a different wall than doing business, because the kind of walls you look at are internal walls. It's if you were in a room and you want to get from the dining room into the bedroom, or you want to get into the living room. We're talking about getting into the house. It's a completely different sort of rule. And that rule will even come with cultural things, which is, this is the way we Peruvians are, what are you doing? This is the way we inherited our law from Spain and from the Incas, don't touch it. The reply to all of that is democracy. Ask them what they want. You know, you don't give them what they want, they move up north to your country. It's very simple. You've got to talk to them. Then you got 1 billion, which are westernized elites, us, and 1 billion, which are you. That's more or less the way we see the world. And everywhere you go, every problem that you can think of, everything you've got is a problem, from Tahrir Square, Palestine, Venezuela, whatever it is, it's about the issue of whether we all get the right to do business or government gets the right to do business. It's really simple. It boils down to that. So you have a very important role to play, I think. And the only thing that we can do, all of those who believe in that, is not get in the way. Not get in the way. Make it easy. It's their revolution.